He's been ranked with Shakespeare, Karl Marx, and the Bible as one of the 10 most quoted sources in academia. I'll speak to Noam Chomsky about the US war against ISIL and his very public spat with the president of Turkey. I'm Mehdi Hasan, also on the show. On the 5th anniversary of the Arab Spring, we'll debate the current state of Egypt with a US supporter of President Sisi and a young activist who was imprisoned and tortured in Cairo. But first, he's been described as arguably the most important intellectual alive. But where does he stand on US airstrikes against ISIL, or even Russian airstrikes? And what's behind his ongoing war of words with President Erdogan of Turkey? In the first of an exclusive two-part interview, I went to Boston to sit down with this week's headliner, Professor Noam Chomsky. Professor Chomsky, thank you for joining me on UpFront. You are probably the world's best-known critic of US foreign policy. Right now, the US government is involved in a war to try and degrade and defeat ISIL in Syria and in Iraq. Do you support the US-led bombing campaign of that brutal, horrific group ISIL? And if not, what do you think should be done, if anything, to try and defeat them or at least reduce the threat they pose to the region and to the wider world?
Well, the first thing, it's a monstrosity. There's no question about that. We know its origins. It developed out of the U.S. invasion of Iraq. You hit a fragile system with a sledgehammer, you cause all kind of problems. One of the many problems, in addition to hundreds of thousands of people killed, millions of refugees, destroying the country, was inciting a sectarian conflict that may have simmered but barely existed before. And out of this came one monstrosity after another. The latest is ISIL. It has another source, the leading U.S. ally in the region, Saudi Arabia, which has been for years funding extremist jihadi groups and also spreading its extremist Wahhabi, Salafi version of Islam through Quranic schools, mosques, radical clerics, and so on. And these things have all fed into ISIS. So the first thing to do is understand it. And there's extensive study of what its appeal is. And it turns out it's disaffected young people living in conditions of humiliation and degradation with nothing in their lives, and most of them don't have much of a background in Islam. Some of them, in fact, are recent converts, but a lot of it's peer pressure, and this is offering them some dignity and hope for their lives.
So you're saying tackle the underlying causes, look at the bigger picture. But I agree with you, and I think a lot of people would say you're right. But in the short term, while you're doing that, that's a long-term operation. In the short term, while they're controlling territory and killing Yazidis and attacking Kurdish towns, how do you stop them?
Well, suppose they're killing Yazidis, so what do? You support the people who are saving the Yazidis, who happen to be on the U.S. terrorist list.
The PKK?
Yes.
The Kurdish
They're the ones who were primarily responsible for saving the Yazidis.
Okay, but so if the Americans say we will drop bombs, and they have been working with various Kurdish groups.
With some, but
do you support that? I'm just wondering, you as a critic, do you support that?
Support the working with the Kurds, yeah. The
U.S. Air Force working with the Kurds to defeat ISIL?
To the extent that they are. Supporting the Kurds in Rojava, as they call it, the Kurdish areas of Syria, have defended their territory, seem to be developing as well as you can under these conditions, a fairly decent society, very different than anything else in Syria. Indeed. Yeah, they certainly merit support.
So you don't object in principle, per se, as some on the left do, to any airstrikes by any Western country? You're saying if there's a practical purpose on the day, in alliance with certain people on the ground, you don't object?
I'm not an absolute pacifist. I think there are times when the use of military forces defensively is...
And ISIL is one of them?
Defending the Kurds against the ISIL attacks, yes, that's legitimate. But you have to look at what's going on. There's other groups there that are not very different from ISIL, like the al-Nusra Front. who are being supported by our ally Turkey and our allies Saudi Arabia and Qatar. The Kurds have to be defended against them too. What you have is a mixture.
They all claim they're not supporting these groups. They say we're supporting the more moderate Islamist groups like Ahrar al-Sham.
But they say that in fact there's no question that they're supporting the al-Nusra Front, and Ahrar al-Sham is not all that different. And Turkey is openly supporting them.
And on that debate about supporting different groups and factions, do you think it's possible to fight the Assad regime and ISIL and some of these other groups you mentioned at the same time? Or are you one of those people who thinks the West needs to get behind Assad in order to defeat ISIL? Is there a lesser of two evils there?
I mean, Assad is a monstrous regime. However, if you cannot both fight both sides who are attacking one another, you're not going. It's an incoherent strategy. So you have to concentrate what you're doing. You have to isolate. There is an answer to the question of what to do with the Assad regime. It's not bombing Damascus. There's one slim hope, slim but the only one. That's the negotiating process. Either you say, let's not have negotiations, let's all murder each other, or you say, let's have negotiations and see what can come out.
You mentioned Turkey. Turkey has recently been hit by several terrorist attacks on city centres, on tourists. Some have been ISIL, some have been the PKK, the Kurdish separatist group. The Turkish president, Mr. Erdogan, recently attacked you by name, saying it's time for so-called intellectuals like you to, quote, pick a side. You are either on the side of the Turkish government, he said, or you're on the side of the terrorists. You responded by saying Erdogan and Turkey had been aiding ISIL. In the past, you've accused Turkey of carrying out a terrorist war against the Kurds.
He's undoubtedly carrying out vicious, repressive actions attacking the Kurdish population. You can call it what you like.
What would you call it?
I'd call it a murderer.
He's a murderer?
Oh, of course. A deeply authoritarian regime, reconstituting policies which in the 90s were totally horrendous. I mean, the 1990s, the Turkish government was carrying out massive state terrorism. Tens of thousands of people killed, thousands of towns and villages destroyed.
You would accept that he would say the people he's fighting are carrying out massive acts of terrorism and murder? You wouldn't deny that?
I don't, and Assad says the same thing about the people he's talking about. I don't pay attention to what leaders of states say.
I'm asking you, though. You would accept the PKK has carried out horrific attacks on civilians?
They have carried out attacks on civilians, yes. I'm not saying we should give military aid to the PKK. On the other hand, if we are interested in attacking ISIS and saving the Yazidi and saving the Kurds, we can't say we're going to attack them. That's they are...
The lesser of two evils.
Look, I don't know, if you want to rank evils, the United States and Britain are so far higher than anyone else that we can put all the others to the side. Yes, there's plenty of evils in the world, but we have to deal with the world as it exists. If you want to defend the Kurds, you cannot be attacking the Kurds.
On the subject of others, the Turkish president recently got into a spat with Vladimir Putin after the shooting down of a Russian jet in Turkish airspace. Some say, your critics say, you're too soft on Putin. You've said, for example, that it might be wrong for Putin's Russia to back the brutal Syrian government, but it's not imperialism, you said recently. Why isn't it? And are sections of the left guilty of only resisting US imperialism, but not Russian imperialism in the Middle East, in Ukraine and elsewhere?
Sorry, imperialism has a meaning.
Yeah.
When the United States supports Saudi Arabia, it's not imperialism, even though it's supporting a brutal and harsh government. When the United States supports Israel, it's not imperialism, even though it's carrying out atrocities. When Russia supports Damascus, it's not imperialism.
So what is imperialism? How do you define it?
We can define what it is, but it's extending your power over states and territories that you're conquering.
So isn't Russia imperialist then, given what it's done in Crimea?
Is he conquering Damascus?
Has it not annexed Crimea?
Crimea is a totally different issue. We can talk about that if you like. But first of all, let's go back to what you started with, the Turkish jet. That was an extremely provocative act. That jet, according to Turkey, crossed for 17 seconds on its way to continue bombing in Syria where it was heading and where it was shot and where it fell after it was shot down. That's an extremely dangerous act.
By the Russians or by the Turks?
By the Turks,
okay,
using an American jet. That's the kind of thing that could set off a major war. And what were the consequences? The consequences were, as expected, that Russia greatly increased its military forces in the region, put in advanced missiles, sent a missile cruiser.
Yeah.
I mean,
okay,
you don't play games
agreed.
like that.
What about the annexing of the actual land of Crimea?
Sorry, the annexing of land in Crimea, I think, was a criminal act, but it has a history.
But imperialist?
Look, is it imperialism?
You used the definition. You gave me the definition as taking land and conquering.
I'm sorry, I don't call it imperialism when the United States supports the government of Saudi Arabia, Israel, Guatemala, and
But you
so
said it is imperialism when you annex land. You said earlier, when you conquer land...
yes, but that's true, and we have to look at what happened. Crimea was handed over to Ukraine
yes.
by Khrushchev,
yes.
Not by the will of the Crimean
people. But that was
people.
60-odd years ago. In recent years, the borders were guaranteed. They were legal borders.
That's correct. That's why I said it's a criminal act. Now, what happened in the background? In 1990-91, the Soviet Union collapsed. There were two visions of how to proceed. One of them was Gorbachev's. Yeah. Let's have a Eurasian security system with cooperation and many central points, Brussels, Moscow, Ankara, and others. The United States had a different position. Let's expand NATO. Let's expand a military alliance to the borders of Russia.
To be fair, a lot of the countries in the region wanted to join NATO democratically.
It's not a matter of being fair. Suppose that the Mexicans wanted to join the Warsaw Pact. Yeah. How would the United States react?
No one's defending the US actions. I'm just looking at the Russian actions. So let me just ask you about Putin. Coming back to Putin, which is how this section began. Do you believe he's only reacting to NATO? He doesn't have expansionist views of his own of recreating a strong Soviet-style Russia? I'm wondering your opinion.
Very little evidence. Look, he's not a nice guy. I don't want to have dinner with him. But these.
But is he an expansionist? Has he got an expansionist vision?
These moves are largely interactive. There are moves on both sides which are interactive. You can't pick one of them and say that's imperialist. There are interactive moves which are dangerous. There's an answer to this. Ukraine can be neutralized. That's the answer. No more talk of NATO enlargement, no talk of... And Ukraine itself is a pluralist country internally. So it can be neutralized, no military alliances, and it can deal with its pluralist internal structure. In that context, Crimea should make its own choices.
That was part one of our exclusive interview with Professor Noam Chomsky. Make sure to watch part two on next week's UpFront, when Professor Chomsky tells me who he'd vote for in the US presidential election, why he doesn't support a full boycott of Israel, and what the rise of Islamophobia has led to. But now it's time for a reality check. As the Cold War between Saudi and Iran threatens to turn hot, let's take a step back and ask, is this really a war within the Muslim world, where all Muslims have to pick a side? Here's the thing. Most Muslims aren't Saudi Arabians or Iranians. In fact, most Muslims don't even live in the Middle East. In terms of population and GDP, Indonesia is the world's biggest Muslim-majority country. And there are more Muslims in Hindu-majority India than there are in Iran and Saudi Arabia combined. So it's not surprising that so many non-Saudi, non-Iranian Muslims across the globe are so tired of being dragged into this ongoing spat between these two bitter Middle East rivals.
The Middle East is going through a transformation that will play out for a generation, rooted in conflicts that date back millennia.
Not true, Barack. Prior to the Islamic Revolution in 1979, Saudi Arabia had good relations with Iran's secular Shah, despite Iran being majority Shia and Saudi being majority Sunni. As recently as 1999, Iranian President Mohammad Khatami visited Saudi Arabia to try and strengthen ties between the two countries. There are no limits to cooperation with Iran, declared the then Saudi foreign minister. The two sworn enemies even signed a security pact. Yeah, a security pact with each other 2 years later. In 2007, the Gulf countries led by Saudi Arabia invited President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad of Iran to attend their summit, where Ahmadinejad even held hands with King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia. Now, I'm not saying relations haven't severely deteriorated in recent years. Of course they have. Leaked US cables suggest the same Abdullah later urged the Americans to, quote, cut off the head of the snake, in reference to the Iranians. And in the wake of Saudi Arabia's beheading of a prominent Shia cleric on January 2nd, Iran's Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei warned Saudi's rulers there'd be divine vengeance. And as a former Saudi royal family advisor told me,
they should be worried. They should be worried. They have the ingredients for a major confrontation.
So things are bad, really bad, and probably only going to get worse. But remember, they haven't always been bad, and they're not bad because of some 1400-year-old theological split. Oh, and most important of all, their spat doesn't have to, shouldn't have to, taint relations between Muslims across the world, the vast majority of whom aren't Iranian and aren't Saudi. It's the 5th anniversary of the Arab Spring, but how much is there to celebrate? In Egypt, the country's first ever elected civilian president, Mohamed Morsi of the Muslim Brotherhood, was ousted in a coup following mass protests. And under his successor, military general Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, there's been a dramatic deterioration in human rights, according to Amnesty International. So, half a decade after the revolution, is Egypt better or worse off than it was before? To debate this issue, I'm joined in the arena from Baton Rouge by Dr. Raymond Stock, an expert on the Middle East who spent 20 years living in Cairo and now teaches Arabic at Louisiana State University. He's praised President Sisi as Egypt's Muslim Churchill. And Mohammed Sultan here in the studio, an Egyptian-American who was locked up and tortured in Egypt for 2 years as a political prisoner until he was released in May 2015, and whose father, a senior Muslim Brotherhood official, is still on death row in Cairo. Gentlemen, thanks for joining me here in the arena. Mohammed Sultan, you're an Egyptian-American citizen who grew up here in the United States, and yet you were arrested by the Egyptian government for taking part in anti-government, anti-coup protests in 2013. You were held for almost 2 years before you were released last year. What happened to you in prison?
We were interrogated, blindfolded. We had welcoming parties. I was beaten up on my broken arm for 2 straight hours. We were made to strip to our underwear, and our heads are shaved. Let me just take you 2 months after that, where I had to get the nails that were placed in my arm removed, surgically removed in an underground dungeon by an inmate, a doctor, with a pair of pliers and scissors, with no anesthesia, nothing. And after that, I started my hunger strike in protest of my illegal detention. And where I saw that there was no law there. The prosecutors told us that, the country's ours. We can do as we will. So seeing that and seeing that there was no way out for me and to protest that, I started a hunger strike January 26th. 2014, and until my release. In that period, I almost died about 10 times. They put me in a designated entire building for me, where there was no light. Everything was stripped away from me, and they started passing me razors and directing me where to cut, so that I can end my misery and theirs. They threw somebody in the room with me, and they let him die, and they left his corpse in the room for 15 hours until they brought him, and then they came and made me feel guilty about it. They tortured my father. They brought him to the same prison and tortured him, torture by proxy, where they would torture him and let me know what they were doing to him.
Well, let me bring in Raymond Stock, who's listening in Baton Rouge. Mohammed Sultan, thanks to being American, has managed to get out of there. But the Egyptian government is believed to be holding more than 40,000 political prisoners behind bars. It's been slammed by every human rights group in the world for unlawful detentions, mass killings, rampant torture, unprecedented use of the death penalty. You've hailed Sisi as a lion, I believe, as a Muslim Churchill. Why is that, given all the human rights abuses going on his watch?
Well, first of all, I think the human rights abuses are a much more complicated phenomenon than just the rise of a Sisi. Egypt has been under what essentially pharaonic-style rule for more than 5,000 years and has an extraordinarily harsh and despotic military government running things behind the scenes, despite elections, despite the rise of a Sisi, who I think is not personally at the same level in a brutality or of harshness as a human being. I don't think he's that sort of person. But I don't think that he controls, or is he taking enough interest in controlling also these sort of abuses. He's focusing on a struggle against 2 things. One, the Islamists who are a global threat to impose these same sort of things on everyone in the world through their harsh rule. And he is also focusing on improving relations between Christians and Muslims, which have really deteriorated under the Islamists, particularly. They were already deteriorating under Mubarak, but they had gotten much worse under Morsi.
It's not a battle between the military and what's called, it's the January 25th revolution, the anti-revolution. You can see that rhetoric in the Egyptian media. You can see that. There are people in the new parliament that are clearly against the January 25th revolution. They are against everything, the ideals and the values of the January 25th revolution, of freedom, democracy, liberty. But just to get back on that, the Islamist part. What I have seen in prison from the recruitment efforts, the ISIS recruitment efforts inside of prison, and the kind of arguments that are being made, simple arguments. First of all, the current environment, as I told you, is unprecedented, okay? That kind of environment, it's already a breeding ground. It should already give us a sense of moral urgency to act.
I want to respond to that very much, because yes, thank you. I really think that, first of all, what happened to Mohammed and so many other people is truly deplorable and really disgusting. At the same time, and there is in fact some truth in the argument that this is radicalizing more people. At the same time, Sisi is working with a very blunt instrument, which is the state security services that were trained by Stasi, even by the Nazis, by other East European security services and the Soviets for many, many years under Nasser and his successors. These are inherently brutal people, and the methods that they use are just incredibly bad. And this is the tragic irony that someone like Sisi rose in this situation, because he's faced with a violent uprising, and it was not a violent uprising that he began. He's not responsible for their violence.
March 16, 2015, okay, we stood before Nagish Hatta, the judge who sentenced the Al Jazeera staff and sentenced me to a life sentence. On that same day, when we returned back to Tura prison, an ISIS guy got released, and my father and 13 others got the death sentence. That should tell you, no, what the Sisi regime, and I don't want to, because Sisi's a figurehead, the entire regime, what it's doing is it's fueling the exact fire that it's attempting to put out.
Human rights groups are pretty much in agreement on the human rights disaster under Sisi right now. But let me put this to you. You wouldn't deny that under Morsi, his predecessor, that was a pretty bad situation too. There were a lot of human rights abuses and abuses of power under Morsi as well.
Listen, I'm not going to sit there. First of all, there are no comparisons between the two.
I'm not saying there's comparisons.
There's thousands of people that have been killed. But I'm not going to sit there. I'm not going to sit there and argue and sit there and compare. The figures are there, and people can compare them for themselves. But what is happening in Egypt is unprecedented in the last 6 decades.
The vast majority of Egyptians I'm in touch with, and I'm in touch with a broad spectrum of people, support Sisi and think that things are far better, far more secure for the average Egyptian. They're not so secure for dissenters, and that is a tragedy and an ironic pity. But it is not a reason, I think, to withdraw our support from the Sisi. The trouble is that as America, for example, many people have talked about withdrawing our aid. We did cut off aid following the overthrow of Morsi at the behest of 30 million Egyptians. We now have restored the aid more or less, but with the proviso that they can no longer buy on credit. So they have turned to the Russians and the Chinese.
The United States government stood by the Egyptian people's choice. It stood by their choice. It stood by the values and principles that the United States, what makes the United States government
the
so
United States government supports Morsi, Raymond says,
no,
not Sisi.
I'm saying
I'm just wondering, from your experience, what was your experience?
No, the United States government, President Obama stood by the choice of Egyptian people, but then even afterwards, the month I got arrested, Secretary Kerry was talking about Egypt's on its way to restoring democracy when me and 6 other American Egyptians were locked up for protesting a military coup.
Do you think Egyptians are better off today, 5 years on, Raymond, than they were before?
I think that they're worse off than they were before the January 25th revolution. I think that they're better off under Sisi generally than they would be under Morsi if he'd continued. I think that, however, it is bad for dissent, bad for those who long to see more civil liberties in Egypt. That situation has to be resolved before the revolution can be considered complete. Sisi, I think, is the best hope for the moment.
Sisi is the best hope for the moment, Mohammed, 5 years on.
Definitely not, and he will be gone soon.
He will be gone soon, in your view. Okay. That's all we have time for, gentlemen. Thanks for joining me in the arena on this anniversary of a rather remarkable historic event in the Middle East. That's our show. Up Front will be back next week.